Hi, my name is Dr. Ronnie Schumann. I am a professor in the Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science here in the College of Health and Public Service at UNT, and I study disasters. So what do I mean by disasters? Think hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, pandemics, earthquakes, even terrorism. Basically anything that results in loss and damage to human communities, because that's really what a disaster is. We can learn a lot by studying these events because disaster scientists like myself, we like to look at human behavior and human impacts after these events. We either approach it from this perspective of risk, where we're looking at how do people perceive these risks in the environment, or we're looking at vulnerability. And vulnerability is what makes us prone to loss in these events in the first place. And very often it's we ourselves as humans that are creating inequality that leads to this loss. So those are the kinds of issues that disaster scientists study. We approach it from a lot of different perspectives. Myself, I am a geographer, so I love questions that have to do with people and place. But you look around the department here, up and down the hall, we've got sociologists, we have folks trained in psychology, we have public administrators. Beyond UNT, there are urban planners, disaster anthropologists, disaster economists, civil engineers, and they all bring really unique perspectives to this study of hazards and disasters. So we're all interested in improving the way that humans adapt to their environment and withstand these extreme events. You might be wondering what attracted me to the field of disaster science, because obviously that's not like your typical biology, chemistry, education. It's not something you come out of high school and say, that's immediately what I want to do. For me, it had a lot to do with my own experience. I had a disaster experience growing up. So I'm originally from New Orleans, and I was in the middle of my undergrad in the early 2000s in Mobile, Alabama, at the University of South Alabama. I was studying meteorology at that point, fascinated by hurricanes and tropical weather. And of course, Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. So that was the event that really brought me into this field. My dad was working for FEMA. He was a civil engineer and a contractor at the time for FEMA. And he and I came back from Alabama, went into the city of New Orleans, and spent a night before the hurricane moving furniture upstairs, boarding up the doors and windows of my parents' house. And we left the next morning really not knowing if we would ever see home again. It was probably the most unsettling feeling I've ever felt in my life. Our house did survive, but my parents were displaced for about a month. When they made it back, we realized that we didn't flood, but a lot of our relatives were not so lucky. So many of the trips that I made back home those last 2 years of college were to come back and help relatives, chop moldy sheetrock out of their homes. I remember eating at, the little kitchen tables in the FEMA trailers where you could reach across from one side to the other. The whole place was just very different. It was dark. There were no street lights at night. There were junk cars piled 2 stories high under the freeways. So you can imagine being around this scene of destruction, the scene of devastation. It really changed my focus. So I became less interested in, looking at the satellite imagery and the Doppler radar and the wind patterns, and much more interested in, so why does that community seem to be further along than this one over here? And why is this group of people really struggling and this group not seem to be struggling as much? So those are the kinds of questions that I still ask as a geographer who studies disasters. Turning to my own previous research, a lot of my projects take me into active disaster zones. So in the past, I've studied Hurricane Katrina's recovery in Mississippi. I've studied the recovery after Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey, been to Eastern North Carolina after the flooding from Matthew, went to Hurricane Harvey, damage there on the Texas coast in Rockport. Recently, I've kind of turned to wildfires. So I'd like to make it out to California to look at some of the damage after the Camp Fire, but I'm just starting that research project right now. So depending on what the situation calls for, I let that determine the method, right? The method that you're using should fit the question that you're trying to answer. And sometimes in my work, it's a statistical index, right? Where you're pulling quantitative data to try and describe vulnerability or map risk. Other times it is qualitative, it's interviews and focus groups. And those are some of my favorite methods because they get at the why questions. It gets into the thought process that people go through as they rebuild, as they decide whether or not they're going to rebuild differently to make themselves safer in the future. And those are really the cool questions, I think. One method that I've enjoyed the most is photo voice. So it's this really cool method where you give cameras to people on the ground and you basically tell them to take pictures and tell stories about the pictures. Show me what's happening in your community, in your home, in your neighborhood. What does it mean to you? So it's kind of like show and tell in that respect. It's really pretty fun. And it allows people, especially people who are members of vulnerable groups, who say might have not been taken seriously in the past, to really show what they mean and show their view of the world. So this is what I did in Mississippi. So in Mississippi, I went down about 8 years after Katrina, and I talked to residents on the ground. So at the time, I was part of a larger research project. And during this project, we were kind of walking around these devastated neighborhoods. And this was 8-9 years after Katrina. It didn't happen yesterday. But we were taking stock of what neighborhoods were rebuilding, what neighborhoods weren't, and it was like life after people. So even though our simple visual survey tool was telling us, oh, this place is mostly recovered, when you looked there, like at that photograph on the left, and you see, slabs where houses were washed away by the storm surge. You see these staircases to nowhere. You look back in the woods and you see boats still up there. Empty lot, slab. It just, this apocalyptic landscape left you wondering, what does it feel like? Does this really represent successful recovery for the people that are there? So employing photo voice here, I was able to capture a lot of the perspectives, particularly of people living in poverty, of a lot of the Black residents in Biloxi who suffered a lot after the hurricane, and the Vietnamese fishermen with very limited capacity to speak English. So very cool insights into that disaster. The other thing that's important about that method is that it really empowers people to tell their stories. So I found that even though residents were kind of reticent to carry this camera around, by the end of it all, they felt really rewarded because they had been listened to, and it ended up being a therapy almost and a part of their own recovery. So that was extremely rewarding. Let me tell you about one more research story, and it pertains to the photo there on the right. So this is a photograph from Rockport in Texas. So this was about a month after Hurricane Harvey. This was a trip that I took with another professor here, Dr. Mary Nealon, and she and I were studying gathering places after Hurricane Harvey. So where were people congregating physically to get resources that they needed, food, water, aid of different sorts, monetary aid, but where were people also gathering for emotional support? So that led us to visit churches, community centers, disaster recovery centers set up by FEMA, these ad hoc campsites that just popped up on the side of roads and on private property where RVs, people just congregated in tents and RVs and whatever shelter they could find. So it led us to a lot of these different gathering places, churches, ad hoc campsites, FEMA recovery centers, community centers. And two things really struck me about this, and I think these two aspects speak to the value of doing this kind of post-disaster work in the disaster zone. The first was what you see in the image behind me. It's something that we call material convergence. So a lot of well-meaning people set up donation drives, they send in their winter coats, they send in bottles of water, they send in toilet paper. Well, that's what happens to this stuff when it gets down there. And I guess I had taught this for so long in my classes and read about this and studied this, but seeing the mountains and mountains of water bottles, seeing literally entire parking lots covered in t-shirts and used clothing in boxes that had been out in the sun for weeks and rained on and infested with rats. That just adds to the debris and the length of recovery for these people going through that. So not a good thing. The other piece of that trip that really stuck out to me was just the complexity of some of the stories I heard. I mean, things I just wouldn't have even considered or imagined before. Like folks who were living in RVs that were really badly damaged and were being denied aid because they didn't have a permanent address there in the area. But they didn't have enough money to stay in these RV parks, but they also didn't have the means to go because their RVs were totaled. We heard instances of people living in their damaged homes, literally raised homes off their foundations, unstable floors, no power, no water, just camping out there because there was nowhere to go. They didn't have the means. We heard stories of pregnant women who were traveling 3, 4, and 5 hours to get prenatal care because there was nothing open in the area, and anything that was open, the insurance wouldn't cover. So just these mismatches between the reality of recovery for these folks and the policies that seem to be failing them in some way. So those kinds of stories, that's what motivates me to do my work, and hopefully it'll motivate you to get interested in disaster research. So the last thing, I want to leave you with some pointers. So 3 pointers if you're interested in disaster research, some things that you can do to get on that road. First off, make sure you familiarize yourself with human subjects research ethics. So if you do any study, if you're talking to people, if you're surveying people, any data collection from live people, you're going to have to run this study through the IRB, the Internal Review Board at UNT. So before you can even do that, you have to take an online series of courses on research ethics. So UNT offers this through the CITI program. Highly recommend getting a jump on that, right? Starting to take those courses so you have that approved and in the works long before you set out to do your research. A lot of departments also offer amazing methods courses that can help you with some of these human subjects methods. So interview skills, focus group skills, survey methods. So look for those kinds of courses in your department or in departments that are similar. Second tip, if you want to go into the disaster field, I recommend coming to talk to us. Talk to someone who's been out there in an active recovery zone. A lot of us have learned a lot about contingency planning before we go, so sometimes you run through plan A and C, B and C, and you're down to plan D. It helps to have really thought that out before you go. So you can learn a lot from listening to others who have been there, both graduate students and faculty. Finally, be creative. That's one thing that I really learned in my work is as I combine pieces of my own experience that I guess I never would have put together years ago. Think about my photo voice, for instance. As a kid, I loved photography and especially landscape photography. And I also have this non-academic background as a historical tour guide and living history interpreter. So what do you do in that case, but you're constantly pointing at things saying, look at this, let me tell you the story behind it. So it's kind of natural that that method was so rewarding for me. So look for those same things in your background, in your path. Don't be afraid to take that course that you might be the only one who sees the connection. Practice explaining that connection. Put those unique skills together, because really, disaster science is an open field. It's so interdisciplinary. That's where the new discoveries are being made, where people come in with these interests and these backgrounds and these skills that no one would have thought to put together. And they can ask these questions about these topics that just, they defy what's out there right now. So be creative, explore, and if disaster research fascinates you, I invite you to come see me, to talk to either me or my colleagues up and down the Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science. Hope to see you soon and hope this inspires your creativity in your research.